I'm gonna sort of paraphrase Renee, but putting oneself out there with no guarantees, right? Fully out there with no guarantees. And I don't think you can lead without doing that.
Welcome to Suffolk's Lessons in Leadership podcast, where we have authentic, wide-ranging conversations on leadership. Each conversation is a deep dive between external experts and Suffolk team members and is designed to help our people build their leadership skills, think creatively, and redefine what's possible. This is Colonel Scott Snook, a West Point graduate who served for 22 years in the U.S. Army. Scott is now an executive fellow at Harvard Business School. We are also joined by Suffolk Chief Marketing Officer Katy O'Neill and EVP Division Manager Pat Lucey, who oversees our commercial work in the Northeast region. Today, we're bringing you a conversation on authentic leadership that is based on a session we recently held during our leadership retreat in Normandy, France. I'm Jay Tangney, your host for today's podcast.
So I grew up in a small farm town in central Pennsylvania, went to our military academy, spent 22 years in the Army. That was the first half of my life. Fell in love with leading and teaching. And then the second half of my life came back to Harvard Business School, where I've been the sort of weird military/leadership guy at the business school. And it's become my passion. I love it.
Thank you for being here, Scott. Appreciate your military service as well. Tell us why authentic leadership is so important.
I think it's fundamental that it starts from our incredibly appreciation as human beings. We have incredibly sophisticated scratch and sniff meters. You know, scratch and sniff. Yeah. I know nobody reads magazines. Remember they have the little piece of cardboard in it?
I'm old enough to remember that.
You're doing that right now. Katy is, Pat's doing, we're constantly scratching. Every time we interact with another human being, we're constantly trying to figure out, am I buying what he's selling? Do I trust her? Do I know where he's coming from? And that's the notion of, are they real? Our politics could be 180 out. We could have very different leadership styles, but at least if when I scratch and sniff, say, oh, I know this person, I know where they're coming from, it's the price of entry. We now maybe can get some work done together. And that's why being real, and then think of someone, we all know people like this, that you've never gotten a beat on, right?
Yeah.
You're just like, wow, I'm just never quite sure when I'm around this person.
Yeah.
I mean, I'll take a screamer who's consistent, the worst leadership style, I hate it, but I'll take a consistent screamer over someone who comes in Monday morning, how are the wife and kids, you have a great weekend, and then 10 minutes later stab me in the back. So I think the appreciation that we're incredibly sophisticated at reading other people, then the implications are, we should just be more real.
Yeah, it's a great way of looking at it, and I think it's a different way of looking at it. Katy, what do you think of authentic leadership in your world?
So just as Scott, as you were talking, I was thinking about sports and how sports are just so foundational. I played soccer growing up. I played soccer in college, and it was a natural, there would be a leader. Do you step into that or do you not? And I liked it. I like to lead. I think people looked up to me, and so then that kind of grew and grew at an early age, so it became more natural when I was in business as opposed to on the soccer field. From an authentic leadership standpoint, I think if you think about people, if you think about yourself, if you have some awareness about who you are, if you are trustworthy, if you are ethical, the profits, the profitability, the business, the success will follow all of that. So from a foundational standpoint, people first. And yes, there's self-awareness in that, but it's also bringing people into that circle from my perspective.
Totally agree, and it's really comparable to sports. So let me shift to Pat. Pat, college athlete, college football player, had a lot of success. How does that translate to authentic leadership for you and your life at Suffolk, building large skyscrapers?
Yeah, I would say that there is a direct relationship to what we do every single day to leadership in sports. And the main reason I'd say that is what we do as far as buildings go is, I always say that Suffolk, our teams are in the communication business, right? We're in the business of being able to understand things and be able to simply communicate that. In our business on a day-to-day basis, that's what we do. And if you think about leadership in sports and how I grew up playing sports, it was really about trying to focus on the team effort and a common goal. And that common goal typically is to win. And what I love about Suffolk is there's nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with that competitive edge. And traditionally, people do incredibly well when they have that. And what I've realized in sports, kind of growing up, Katy, as Katy was mentioning before, growing up, I thought leadership was about being the best player, right? And then as you get into high school and you get into college, you realize that there's opportunities for the team to be better. If individuals can play the right role, one of the things I say to my kids all the time is selfishness over, or selflessness over selfishness, right? And you start to realize that in sports. And I think one of the things that's amazing about my time and my tenure here at Suffolk is, number one, I have a job today that I never thought I'd have, right? Thanks to so many people that have been able to mentor me. Number two is, one of the things that I realized is that if we can connect these dots together through a level of selflessness, through individuals having leadership, hard work, those types of components, the benefit at the end and what we have to look forward to at the end is so much greater than any individual can realize if we can just work together. But what I love about sports, and I'll tie this to Suffolk, is it's not about everybody being the best, it's about everybody being the best in their role and being selfless in that approach.
I think it's an important point, and I think it leads to something that we should talk about, because we all know life's a competition, right? And it's a sports competition, it's a life competition, it's a competition in the military, it's a competition at HBS. Part of that leadership, and Pat alluded to it a little bit, is vulnerability, because it's not about necessarily being the best star player. It's about not being selfish, and it's also about being vulnerable to the people on your team. And I think that's something that, at least for me, is relatively recent as I've evolved and thought more about like kind of authentic leadership. Scott, how does vulnerability and leadership come together in some of the stuff you write about, teach about?
Yeah, I think it's essential, right? I'll reference Brene Brown, who I think has done her research over the last 10, 15 years, has done more for our field of leader development than all my colleagues at Harvard, or certainly myself or my colleagues in the last 20 years. And one of the biggest contributions she made was the counterintuitive role that vulnerability plays. And I'm gonna sort of paraphrase Brene, but putting oneself out there with no guarantees, right? Fully out there with no guarantees. And I don't think you can lead without doing that. In fact, going back to thinking about Normandy and the military examples, there's an example that she talks about. She went into a small group of really elite warriors in the Army, and they had already done the pre-reading, the TED Talk on vulnerability. And she wanted to ask them, like, everyone in here has witnessed some examples of true battlefield courage. She said, without triggering you emotionally, but like, call to mind a specific example of battlefield courage on the battlefield. And then she paused. She said, now, given our definition of vulnerability, right, any of your examples not include that hero being vulnerable, putting oneself out there with no guarantees, getting out of the foxhole under fire and dragging your wounded colleague back together, risking something, taking the hill in Normandy, going to the Rangers, going up point to, like, you know, and she said, and in fact, vulnerability we used to think of as weakness. It's actually the very definition of courage. And I don't think you can step into that leadership arena without putting yourself out there. And the no guarantees part, if you want to be an individual contributor your whole life, you work harder, better, faster, smarter, longer, stronger, you can control largely your outcomes, right? But you step into that arena and all of a sudden, we're gonna assess you as a leader based on what other people do. And by definition, you've now given up control. And so I don't think you can actually lead without being vulnerable. And I think then that leads to all the secondary effects around deeper engagement and connection that we can talk about.
I think it's really an interesting connection too between the construction industry and the military, because they're obviously very different with very different objectives. However, there are certain things that are common to both. One is an environment that's fiercely competitive and tends to be tough on each other, right? Because, you know, when people ask me about Suffolk, I describe it as a place where a lot needs to happen every day. That's true whether it's raining, whether you're not feeling well, whether there's COVID, whatever's going on in the world. We have a lot to do every day at all our different projects. And that creates this tenacity and this toughness, something that the military obviously has. How tough is it to translate that into vulnerable leadership in that environment?
Well, let me just talk a little bit about my experience at Suffolk, and it has been incredibly humbling. The difference between Pat and I is Pat started right out of college, learned on the ground everything that he was doing. I have been in a position where every role I've had is something I've never done before. And if there's anything that makes you humble or vulnerable, then that is it. So I was recruited 6 years ago into a BD role. I did not come from construction. I did not have relationships within the organization that could help me. And so having to sort of turn to my team and say, I need help. You help me. You've done this more than I have done this. Teach me, show me, and I'll stand up for you. And in each, I've had a couple of different roles, a proposal writing team, the pursuit marketing team. I've never written a proposal before. So I lead a team of individuals who are so capable, and it's like a vulnerability of saying, it's okay to not know exactly what you're doing. And so
Scary,
I approach that like so openly with them, and I've learned so much from the people who work for me. And what that does engender is trust, because I've led with this notion of, I don't know it, you know it better than I do. Together, let's figure it out. And I think that's empowered people to do more than they maybe have done. And it's kind of how I've managed my time here.
And I think it creates fierce loyalty, right?
Right.
To you because you're open about it.
Sure.
And I feel the same way because I always say the same thing to people. I'm not a construction lawyer.
Right.
I'm surrounded by extremely talented construction lawyers who I rely and depend on to do what they do. And I'm open about that.
Right.
And they know.
You've learned as much from them,
I learned as
I'm
much
sure,
from them as they've learned from me, probably a lot more.
Right.
And I think that kind of vulnerability lends itself to team building, but it is also sometimes inconsistent with this tough, tenacious environment when you're on a vertical project where the curtain wall sub goes out of business, and we all have to dig in and fight through that, Pat, with your team.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. I think I'll go back a little bit how Katy did. I'll go back to kind of the beginning points of my career. When you're on one project, for me, it was really about the objective of learning as much as I possibly could on that job. I kind of think a little bit of like a command and control. You kind of divide it up amongst people, command and control. We know everything. We can work together. We can figure it out. And in my current position now, there is so much opportunity for me to not be able to do that and to rely on so many amazing people. And over the last several years, as I've gone from one project to multiple projects and now dozens of projects, I think one of the things that's been really amazing opportunity for me is to realize, number one, how amazing our people are. How committed they are, how open they are. We have a core value at Suffolk of caring. If somebody really cares, then there is no doubt in my mind you're not gonna take the easy way out. You're not gonna not tell them something. You're not gonna think from their perspective. And I think the one thing that's been amazing in my tenure here is I've seen this cultural growth at the organization too, right? Not only through the highest levels of leadership at the organization, but through the many levels of leadership at the organization, through the many departments. And when I think of how I communicate, it's interesting when you talk about authentic leadership. One of the ways that I communicate when someone says, well, because Suffolk's the only job I've ever had, never worked anywhere else, right? Or they say, well, what makes you go there? Why do you stay there? What's like the difference between everything else? And what I say every single time is, because of the people that I'm surrounded with on a day-to-day basis and the level of caring they have and the level of commitment they have, I am a better person. I'm a better person at work. I challenge myself more. I'm a better husband. I'm a better father, because the opportunity to do that isn't there, because you have to be present all the time. You have to be there for the people that depend on you, right? And that doesn't mean to say that there aren't sacrifices accordingly, but that level of caring that we see across the organization, I think, is the way that I see through the individuals that I've had the opportunity to mentor me, and hopefully some of the ones that I'm mentoring today. And obviously, as I continue in my career, really want to continue to develop that, because that's how I see authentic leadership. Does someone give a shit about me? If so, I'm going to go through a wall.
So in my house, we call that the give a shit factor, which is something I talk to my kids about all the time. And I think it's true in life. And maybe it's not politically correct to frame it that way, but I do think it's a real thing, and it's off the charts high at Suffolk. I think one of the things or two of the things maybe you alluded to in your comment there, Pat, in connection with vulnerable leadership, are empathy and sympathy for people that you're trying to lead and help and support. And I think conceptually, Scott, that's evolved in my 8 years at Suffolk into something that we think about, to Pat's point, much more deliberately in terms of how we deal with each other. This environment is a challenging environment. This industry is not for everybody. But we have tried to make it more welcoming and open, I think, right, for people with a lot of the different programs that we have, all the core values we have. How does empathy and sympathy translate into authentic leadership, authentic, vulnerable leadership in your world?
So get to those two words, because I always used to get them confused for years. The difference between empathy and sympathy. You know, when someone's struggling, should I feel empathic? Should I feel sympathetic? But as I was listening to these stories, you talk about the simplest models that stick. So in my experience in the military, there's something we call the 3 M's that kind of pull together what I heard Katy talking about, Pat talking about, and leads to your question, which is also the answer to why not everyone should lead and why we get paid the big bucks with successful leaders. It's called mission first, and unfortunately, because it's mostly a male-dominated profession, men always, me last. And if you think about the paradox of that, take the first two, right? Mission first, men always. Well, you can't accomplish the mission unless you take care of your people. But in my previous profession of arms, accomplishing the mission many times means actually sacrificing your soldiers, right? And so this is why it's not easy, right? I mean, and to balance those, you talk about the give a shit factor and caring, how do you say your most important asset is your people, and at the same time say you have to accomplish the mission, you have to get the job done. And it's holding those two and saying, well, you got to pick one or the other. No, the greatest organizations are able to manage that tension at the highest levels. And then me last is always just servant leadership. And you see it when it works the other way around. When the arrow's pointing at the leader, it's so obvious. When the arrow's pointing away, it's, that's the price of admission. And then when you get to someone who's struggling, and how should you feel? I remember with #MeToo and Black Lives Matter as a privileged white person, like, how am I supposed to feel about, my black brothers and sisters, really good friends of mine, and am I supposed to feel sympathetic or empathetic? I mean, empathy is just sort of the ability to I know how you feel. Well, at some level, that's arrogant. And I tell the story sometimes. My wife, Kathy, had 5 children, and I want to be really supportive. So I went through Lamaze and the first thing and all the breathing techniques. So I'm there. She's in labor with Sean, her first child, and I'm like breathing with her, and she's like heavy labor. And I said, oh, honey, I'm trying to be empathetic. I said, oh, honey, I know how you feel. Right in the middle of a contraction, she stops, grabs my arm, bites me, and says, you got no idea how I feel, right?
I'm with her.
Yeah. And it's like, there are bounds to our ability to say, I know how you feel. And it can be disrespectful in some way. I don't know what what it's like for a black 22-year-old man to be stopped by a Boston police officer at 2:00 in the morning at Everett, right? I don't know how it feels, because I can't say that I do. I can do what we call difference between affective and cognitive empathy. Cognitively, I can try to understand how that might feel, or how Kathy might understand how she might be feeling. But for me to say, I get you, I know how you feel, at some level, there's a limit to that, because you really don't. And so empathy, though, is just getting started. It's like, I'm here for you, and then sympathy, I think, is not the right answer when people are struggling. Sympathy is, oh, it's bad. And as Brene Brown says, you want a sandwich, right? I mean, and that turns whoever's struggling into a victim. And the last thing someone wants to be when they're struggling is a victim, right? Instead of empowered. For me, it starts with empathy. And then the third one I would throw out there is compassion, which is, what do you do once you try to imagine or feel the pain or the sorrow or the struggle that someone's going through? And that's just love. That's just a response of caring, which you already talked about.
So can I build off of
Yeah, please,
Scott,
absolutely.
if you don't mind? You absolutely got me thinking, and when we last met, about sympathy and empathy. Before that, both are really nice, right? I'm sympathetic to what's going on with you, but the distinction that you've raised, I think, is an important one. And I look at my own life. I'm the mom of a daughter with special needs. We're in an amazing community in which she is supported, but there's accepting and there's belonging. She is accepted, she is supported, but she's not belonging, because she's different from everybody else. And so I have the benefit and gift of working with and having a daughter who is like that, who is challenged every day. So I leave that in my mind when I come to work too, about not everybody at Suffolk is the same. We've got introverts, we've got extroverts, we've got high performers, we've got aspiring performers, right? So how do you help support and have people belong as opposed to just being accepted too? So it's a little spin-off of sympathy and empathy, but something that kind of exists in my world.
Everyone's fighting a battle sort of behind the mask that we all wear, right? Whatever that battle is, whether it's a challenge at home, an intellectual challenge, a physical challenge, and that's not out there for the world. So that is something I think that lends itself to being deliberate about sympathy and empathy, whether it's, with the people that you work with or just people that you manage relationships in your life. And it's hard. And I think a lot of what we're talking about is that sort of deliberate leadership, which really is part of overall emotional intelligence, right? And we've all been around people who don't have it. Those are probably the people who should be individual contributors, to your point, Scott. Emotional intelligence is part of authentic leadership. What does it mean?
Well, I'll go back to the comment that I made beforehand when we were talking about authentic leadership. It was about caring, right? If somebody has a level of caring in them, wants the best for the people around them, and truly wants the best. And what I mean by wants the best is interesting too, is like, I say a lot of times in my experience here at Suffolk, like anybody can do it for a week, anyone can do it for a month, anyone can do it for a year, but do it day to day, day after day, year after year. It's hard. It's hard work. And it's not just hard work working at Suffolk. It's hard work being a husband, being a father. It's hard work to just be that way and be consistent. So the way to do it is to be yourself.
Sure.
And to do it that way. I feel like when you have that level of caring inside you, you have the ability to take a step back and think about things from other people's perspective. You just mentioned like we're all going through our battles, and I find myself, it happens to me all the time, every day, is walking into a room thinking about something else. I've been fortunate enough to have a few individuals that have worked very closely with me for a period of time, and I'll be very vulnerable here. There was a period of time when I was just trying to do too much. And it was evident to everybody. It was evident to me. I had a lot of people that cared about me. So one of the things we used to say before we'd walk into a room is, remind me to be human, remind me to be human, remind me to be human, because that allows that person inside to affect everybody. And I feel like that really ties to your emotional intelligence, because the more somebody can be committed, determined, and caring, that is a recipe for success, in my opinion. Well, whether that's an individual, whether that's a parent, whether that's somebody at a company, or then specifically somebody at Suffolk, because living life and working in a tough environment is hard. So you have to be yourself when you do it.
Pat's raising a lot of important issues, and one thing that comes to mind is being present when you walk into those meetings, mentally present and actively listening. In this day and age, it's tough, right? Even sitting down here for 45 minutes or an hour, none of us have our phones. When was the last time that happened in my life? I couldn't tell you. I went an hour without my phone. It feels pretty good, to be honest. How do you balance that presence, that need to be present in leadership, with all the distractions and all the different pulls we get and tensions in life?
First rule of the gym, show up, right? And be fully there, right? And I'll share with you from my own developmental perspective. Each year I come up with a goal or two, personal development goal. And the goals for me this year are two. One is to be more present, and I'll explain that a bit. And the second is related, but is to be a better listener. And they go together. So to be more present, like literally we have 7 grandchildren, and 3 of them were here last week, for the holidays. And literally, could I walk into the kitchen, leave my phone in the bedroom? Could I actually, like when I'm actually with my grandchildren, can I be fully with them and not have the TV on or not be thinking about something else? And it's a challenge. As human beings, we're not hardwired to pay attention for long periods of time. We just, as you know, which is why phones work and apps work, and we understand how that works. So for me, it's a constant struggle. Vulnerable, I'll share with you those 2 goals, developmental goals. They're the same ones I've had for the last 3 years. I'm a slow learner, but I've found so much growth and meaning and leverage in those 2. So any interaction with any human being, I'm just reminded, like, can I really be fully with whoever I'm talking to? And at least monitor a little bit, like, how much am I speaking versus actually listening? Instead of when you're talking, and I think, what's the next thing I'm going to say? Which time thing? How's my body language? Actually, and if you've ever sit across from a great listener, at a party or something, you're like, oh my gosh, I've been talking for 40 minutes. I haven't asked anything about them, right? It is the most amazing gift you can give another human being. It goes back to like caring, right? People want to be fully seen and heard. Like if one of your employees or someone in a crew didn't show up, would anybody care? I mean, that's like, and that just takes another human being to be on the other side. And so for me, at the deepest level, those two, being fully present, and then when you're there to actually see what you're seeing and listen to what you're listening to those are lifelong goals for me.
All great points.
Yeah,
What do you think?
well, on the emotional intelligence side, I would say as leaders within this organization, we probably all have that skill. Like we know people who don't have EQ, right? I would argue that this group and many people at Suffolk do. They are aware of themselves, but they can read the room and read the impact that a conversation or a debate or something is having on individuals. The next step is that how do you change that dynamic? And how do you bring somebody in? So this person in the corner, I know that they're struggling a little bit. So Sally, tell us a little bit about what you think right now, or try and draw people in, because there's a responsibility of a leader to then recognize it as opposed to saying, let me talk to you outside, which I respect, and some moments are made for that. One-on-one conversations with individuals in which you give feedback is an important thing to do as a leader, but can you fix something in the moment which actually would be more powerful in the future?
I totally agree. I also think a lot of that comes down to reading nonverbal signals from people, because we've all been in those situations where if you're really authentically listening, it's not just with these, it's with everything.
Right.
You can tell when someone's uncomfortable, and then you have a choice. Are you going to help them? Or are you going to discard whatever comes out of their mouth next? And that active listening is, I'm not sure there's anything more important as a leader.
Have you ever been paying attention? If we rewind this tape, there's a really good active listening person in the five of us. So you are incredible active. Like noticeable when someone else is speaking. Like verbally, you notice Katie's like, yes, like, wow, actually somebody's engaged and actually reinforcing me while I'm speaking.
I'm just freaking out here. That's
but I actually feel that. And I actually, when I'm speaking, I listen to others, I can feel that support because you're actually responding and you're like, yes, I get that. Yeah, just those, even the verbals of supporting someone, the micro interactions, right? You get a feeling. And it's like when you say someone, you said, wow, I'm drawn to her. I feel she's got my back. I trust they're transparent. They're trustworthy. It comes from those little sort of skills, and I can just feel that coming from Katy. If you rewatch this tape, you'll hear her actually nodding, not just verbally.
It's the biggest compliment anybody's ever given me. That's very kind. Thank you.
I'm not good at it.
I think something you touched upon, though, that Katy obviously does well, and I think it's something that we all can do better is, and again, I talk to my kids about it, when someone is talking to you and you're listening, if you're thinking about what you're going to say next to rebut it or respond or resist, you're not actively and authentically listening enough. And that's because we're all always trying to prove our point, right? We're trying to prove our point verbally, trying to prove our point in writing.
Demonstrate capability.
It's like with email. You get an email from somebody 2 doors down, and instead of getting up and saying, hey, let's have a conversation, you send an email back and get it out of your inbox. And the last thing I think that we're all talking about is not always being in a rush. Being present with your grandkids, being present with your team, being present on the job sites, and not always checking your phone, and not always being late, not always, what's next. That's something I try to work on all the time. And it's hard because I do think frequently we're pressed for time and we're overscheduled and we're trying to get things done. So,
and the more senior you get, for the two really senior people in the room, this challenge of filling the space and moving on, you get busier. You already mentioned that you can't do it all, right? Figuring out you can't do it all. And the second is when you show up at a work site as the most senior person, people naturally want to hear what you have to say. And so you have a lot to say and you naturally fill that void. As we get more and more senior, like when the colonel shows up, the general shows, like, how can you flip that? We actually have to be intentional as we're more senior to find out what ground truth is. When you show up in construction, everything's going great. Everything's going, how do you, and it's not up to, well, I have an open door policy. I said, I'm willing to listen to anything you have to say. You literally, as you get more and more senior, have to be creative in ways to make sure you understand what the ground truth is. And there was a study, just summarized very quickly, like around 80% to 20% is the tipping point on both sides. If a senior leader spends 80% of their time during the day on transmit and 20% on receive, if they're talking 80% of the time, there was a statistically significant decrease in their effectiveness, perceived openness, and trustworthiness, right? So, and the other thing was true. Those senior leaders, this was done at CEO level, those senior leaders that were on listening 20% of the time, and this is from running into the maintenance guy in the hallway, to they follow them the whole day around, to meetings, to everything, 80% listening and 20% speaking, there's a statistically significant kick in both the effectiveness and perceived trust and openness of the leader. And so the more senior we get, it becomes more natural to fill the airspace because we have stuff to say, they want to hear you say it. And you got to be really, really creative and disciplined. The EQ, self-awareness, and then the second part is self-regulation. So I'm aware, I'm talking too much, and then can I actually figure out a way to flip that to like 80-20 the other way?
I think part of that too, and old trial or trick, just remaining silent in the silence. It's a learned skill because it creates this air in the room where people feel uncomfortable and obligated to talk. But it's
not Katy.
I almost felt that space like that.
but it makes you present in the room. Right. It doesn't fill the room with just words and noise, and it gets people's attention. I mean, if you ever want to get a room's attention as a senior leader, right, walk in and say nothing and hold it for 20 seconds. Pretty soon everyone's going to stop talking. They might start staring at their shoes, and they're going to start looking at you, and then you have their full attention.
We teach case study method at HBS, and easily in the top 3 skills is to use silence and just wait and to be comfortable in the silence. And then if you really want to learn about someone, right, and then they'll naturally fill that space. But to get comfort with your own discomfort about being, it's hard. It's really hard. And great listeners are incredible at it. And oh, by the way, if you only speak 20% of the time, those leaders, when they do speak, people really listen.
Yeah, that's more meaning. Closing comments? Well, let's start with ladies first again. Thank you for being here.
Thank you for the opportunity. One of the things is, as we were talking and thinking about what's next for Pat and I, how are we growing into the leaders that we want to be? We each have, probably speaking for you too, Pat, is love people. Love to help resolve issues, help people grow, empower people. And the more that you do that, the more you're spreading across different teams, the less you have time to be able to do that. And so when I think about Pat being asked to do more, myself being asked to do more, how do you remain true to who you are and what you love and how you got here, and also continue to grow as a leader and take on more responsibilities? So when I think about the next frontier for me and what I want to do next, I still got some years in me, Jay. I'm here for a little while.
No doubt.
I need to be mindful about staying true to myself, doing what's best for the business, building a team and a culture that is good for Suffolk and supports me too.
That's terrific. Couldn't agree more. Pat?
As I think about what we've talked about today and some of the things that we've learned over the course of the last few months, I can't help but kind of relate it back to my career and my tenure at Suffolk and the opportunities that I've been provided through different individuals. And similar, Katy, to what you were saying, I think one of the things that just continues to stand true is people consistently being themselves, right? And that leads to people having them the approach is very predictable. The willingness for them to help out people is very predictable. And I think one of the things that I'm really focused on going forward, I would say with my teams, is making sure they can be themselves at work and outside of work. We are fortunate enough to have a lot of people that like to coach their kids' sports or go to different plays or to do all those types of things. And I can't tell you how many times I've had anxiety about going to do something like that. And when I was there, I was present the whole time, right? And when I came back, I was a better version of myself afterwards, right? And I think for our teams and our employees, the more we can focus on it, I'll go back to what Scott said about kind of the 3 M's. I started to think in my mind about a little bit of an evolution we've had at Suffolk is feel like when we used to staff projects, it would be about the client, it would be about Suffolk as a company, and then it would be about the individual. And I feel like across the company, but particularly here in the Northeast, our approach has been, what's the right thing for the individual employee we have first? Then how does that benefit where the company fits in? And do we fill all the gaps and all the risks? And then third, for the client, right? And if you lead with the individual, then you're going to get the best out of that individual. and they're going to be able to be themselves. So an area that I've been focused on, inwardly and more outwardly over the last few years. And I think something that I'm looking forward to continuing to develop and learn from, and then hopefully some people can learn from me.
Thanks, Pat. Scott?
For me, the biggest eye-opener, and I think I shared this when we were together as a group, was my fundamental assumptions about human nature. At every interaction, from the person I met walking to the elevator, coming in here today, to the person at the airport or the bus or my Uber driver or whatever it was, that I think the best of. I think they're amazing. I just think that if we look for the good, we'll find it. And if we look for the bad, we'll find it too. Like if people look for that in me, and so for me, it's changed everything, because I believe people are incredible. Everyone has something incredible to bring. And part of our goals is to find, as leaders, we have the ability to put people in the right places where they can bring all that crazy, wonderful stuff to the world. But for me, when I was a leader in the Army, and the more senior I got, I found myself spending more time with problems, because that's what comes to us as leaders, problems and challenges, and you look for the bad, and pretty soon you can find yourself spiraling, and you just keep finding the bad because it's always there, and the challenges and struggles, and bad is stronger than good. We are hardwired to look for threats in our environment. So for me, to be more intentional and just say, every person I meet, I'm going to look for the good in them, and until they fall short, which sometimes they do, but it's changed it. It's changed my life. It's absolutely changed my life. So for me, that's the biggest gift that a wise person shared with me about 15 years ago.
That's a deliberate decision every day.
Every interaction.
You want to assume the best in people. It's like you wake up every day with a positive attitude wherever you go. It can be sort of life-changing.
And it's selfish. It comes right back.
So thank you all for being here. Lots of wonderful takeaways about authentic leadership and a whole bunch of other things. I feel like I've learned a lot. I hope you all have too. And we sincerely appreciate you coming out and sharing all your views today. You've been listening to Suffolk's Lessons in Leadership. If you haven't yet, please go to Apple Podcasts and subscribe, rate, and review this podcast. Join us next time for another leadership conversation. Thanks for listening.